On July 26, 1875, in a quiet Swiss village on the shores of Lake Constance, a child was born whose inner world would one day reshape our understanding of the human soul. His name was Carl Gustav Jung. From the very beginning, his life unfolded between two realms, the visible and the invisible. His father, Johann Paul Jung, was a Protestant pastor, a man of scripture and reason, bound by the structures of faith and tradition. But his mother, Emilia Preiswerk Jung, carried a different kind of truth, one that lived in silence, in shadows, in moments when her presence seemed to split into two, the woman who cooked and cleaned, and another, deeper presence, one the young Carl could not name. She would withdraw into long silences, speaking of spirits, of dreams, of voices from beyond. To the boy, she was not just a mother, she was a gateway, a living bridge between the ordinary world and something far older, far more mysterious. Jung grew up in solitude. He was not a lonely child because he lacked company, but because he felt too much. While other boys played, he sat by the lake, staring into the water, sensing that beneath the surface another reality pulsed. He had dreams that felt more real than waking life, visions of a phallus growing from the center of the earth, of gods whispering in forgotten tongues, of vast underground temples where time did not exist. These were not nightmares, they were visitations. And though he said nothing, he knew even then that the mind was not a machine, but a sacred space, alive with forces beyond logic. He carried this inner world with him into his studies. At the University of Basel, he chose medicine, not out of ambition, but out of a quiet need to understand what lies beneath the surface of things. Psychiatry, in particular, called to him, a field still in its infancy, dismissed by many as mere speculation. But Jung saw it differently. To him, it was the last frontier of science, the only discipline brave enough to ask, "What is the soul?" While his peers focused on symptoms and diagnoses, Jung built intricate models of mythological temples, read ancient alchemical texts, and asked questions that bordered on the heretical. Are the gods of old truly dead, or do they live on, not in temples, but inside us? When he began working at the Bergholzli Psychiatric Hospital under Eugen Bleuler, he was already an anomaly, a doctor who listened not just to words, but to silences, to pauses, to the tremor in a patient's voice. He developed the word association test, a method that revealed how certain words triggered emotional reactions, exposing hidden complexes buried deep in the psyche. This was revolutionary. It proved that the mind was not a rational machine, but a living network of symbols, memories, and repressed truths. And it was this work that caught the attention of a man in Vienna, Sigmund Freud.
Their meeting in 1907 was not just a professional encounter, it was an event of psychological magnitude. For 13 hours straight, they talked about dreams, sexuality, the unconscious, the nature of neurosis. Freud, then the undisputed leader of psychoanalysis, saw in Jung a brilliant mind, a worthy heir. And Jung, for the first time, felt seen, understood by a thinker who dared to explore the darkest corners of the mind. Freud called him my crown prince. Jung called him the master. For years, they exchanged over 350 letters shaping the future of psychoanalysis together. But no intellectual alliance can survive the awakening of a deeper truth. Jung began to question Freud's central doctrine that all human motivation stems from repressed sexuality. To Jung, this felt too narrow, too reductive. He had seen patients whose suffering could not be explained by childhood trauma or sexual repression. He had seen visions, symbols, and dreams that echoed ancient myths, not personal, but universal. There was something larger at work, a layer of the psyche that transcended the individual. He called it the collective unconscious, a vast reservoir of inherited images, patterns, and archetypes shared by all of humanity. Freud could not accept this. To him, it was mysticism. And so, the break came.
In 1912, Jung published Psychology of the Unconscious, later titled Metamorphoses and Symbols of Libido, a work that openly challenged Freud's views. The rift was immediate. Freud distanced himself. The psychoanalytic community turned against Jung. He was isolated, accused of betrayal, of losing his scientific rigor. And in that moment of exile, Jung faced something far more dangerous than professional rejection. He faced himself. After the rupture with Freud, Carl Jung entered a period of profound inner collapse, what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious. It began not with a decision, but with a descent. Visions came to him uninvited. Dreams overwhelmed his sleep. He heard voices. He saw figures emerging from the shadows of his mind, not as hallucinations, but as autonomous beings, speaking with their own will, their own wisdom. He would later write, "I was forced to say to myself, I must go into the darkness, for I can no longer stand in the light." Between 1913 and 1919, Jung withdrew from public life. He stopped attending conferences. He reduced his clinical work. Instead, he turned inward, deliberately engaging with the images that arose from his psyche. Every night, he would sit in stillness, allowing the visions to unfold. He recorded them in a private journal, painted them, dialogued with them. This journal, bound in red leather, would remain hidden for decades. Today, it is known as the Red Book, one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of psychology.
In its pages, Jung descends into a mythic landscape. He meets Philemon, a wise old man with wings, who becomes his inner guide. He speaks with Elijah, with Salome, with the spirit of the depths. He witnesses floods, resurrections, the death of gods. These were not fantasies. To Jung, they were real encounters, not in the physical sense, but in the psychological. He believed that the unconscious is not a void, but a living world, populated by forces that shape our lives, whether we acknowledge them or not. He did not know if he was becoming a visionary or a madman. At times, he feared he was losing his mind. But he pressed forward, guided by one unwavering principle. If the images are real to the psyche, then they must be treated as real. He did not suppress them. He did not pathologize them. He honored them. And from this descent, a new psychology emerged, analytical psychology, a path not of curing symptoms, but of becoming whole. One of its central concepts is the shadow, the part of ourselves we deny, repress, or project onto others. It contains not only our darkest impulses, aggression, envy, selfishness, but also our unexpressed talents, our suppressed emotions, our buried passions. The shadow is not evil, it is exiled, and Jung believed that until we confront it, we cannot be free. To ignore the shadow is to live in denial. To project it is to see monsters in others. But to integrate it, to say, "This too is me," is the first act of psychological courage.
He also introduced the anima and animus, the inner feminine in men, the inner masculine in women. These are not literal genders, but symbolic forces that shape how we relate to the world and to ourselves. The anima is the soul image, the source of emotion, connection, and depth in a man. The animus is the logos, the inner voice of clarity and conviction in a woman. When neglected, they become destructive. The anima turns into moodiness, the animus into rigidity. But when embraced, they bring balance, insight, and wholeness. Jung saw the human journey not as a climb to perfection, but as a process of integration, a lifelong movement toward what he called individuation. This is not individualism, it is not isolation. It is the slow, painful, beautiful work of becoming who you truly are, by reclaiming every lost part of yourself. The child who was silenced, the dreamer who was shamed, the rebel who was punished, all of them must be welcomed back. And this process, Jung insisted, is not optional. It is the only way to avoid what he called spiritual death, the slow erosion of the soul that comes from living a life that is not your own. Yet even as he mapped the psyche, Jung knew that psychology alone could not answer the deepest questions. He turned to alchemy, not as a primitive science, but as a symbolic language of transformation. The alchemist's quest to turn lead into gold was, for Jung, a metaphor for the soul's journey, the transmutation of suffering into meaning, of darkness into consciousness. He studied Eastern philosophies, Native American traditions, Christian mysticism, tarot, and Gnostic texts, not to collect beliefs, but to find the universal patterns beneath them. He saw that myths, dreams, and religious symbols were not primitive attempts to explain nature, but expressions of the psyche's inner dynamics. And in this, he found a truth that would define his life. The psyche and the sacred are inseparable. As Jung emerged from his inner crisis, he did not return as a man with answers. He returned as a guide, one who had walked through the fire and come back with a map. He began to speak openly about what he had learned, not as dogma, but as invitation. He taught that the unconscious is not an enemy to be conquered, but a source of wisdom to be listened to. That dreams are not random firings of the brain, but messages from the self, the deepest center of our being. That symbols are not decorations, but the language of the soul. And in this, he challenged the foundations of modern life. He saw that industrial society, with its obsession with progress, efficiency, and control, was creating a new kind of suffering, not of the body, but of the spirit. People were losing touch with their inner world. They were becoming what he called personas, masks worn so long they forget the face beneath. The successful businessman who feels empty, the loving parent who feels numb, the spiritual seeker who feels disconnected, all of them wearing roles that no longer fit. Jung warned that when the persona dominates, the self is buried. And when the self is buried, the unconscious fights back through depression, through addiction, through breakdowns that feel like punishment but are actually calls to return. He believed that the great crisis of the modern individual is not a lack of knowledge, but a loss of meaning. We have mastered the external world. We fly, we cure diseases, we connect instantly across continents. But inwardly, we are adrift. We ask, why am I here? What is my purpose? Why does nothing feel real anymore? To these questions, Jung offered no easy answers, but he offered a path. He called it active imagination, a practice of entering into dialogue with the unconscious, not through drugs, not through blind faith, but through disciplined inner work. Sit in silence. Allow the images to come. Speak to them. Let them speak to you. This is not madness. It is the oldest form of wisdom, the same practice used by shamans, mystics, and prophets.
He also introduced the concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that cannot be explained by cause and effect. A dream of a bird followed by a bird tapping on your window. A thought of an old friend followed by their call. A phrase in a book that feels like it was written for you. These, Jung said, are not random. They are signs that the inner and outer worlds are connected, that mind and matter, psyche and reality are not separate, but part of a deeper unity. To the scientific mind, this sounded like superstition, but Jung insisted, if we dismiss the meaningfulness of such events, we cut ourselves off from the soul's language. And perhaps his most radical idea was this: psychology is not separate from spirituality. For Jung, the search for self is the search for the divine. God, he said, is not just out there. God is also in here, in the depths of the human psyche. Religious symbols, the cross, the mandala, the lotus, are not just cultural artifacts. They are expressions of inner processes, attempts to give form to the unfathomable. He did not preach any religion, but he defended the need for one, not as dogma, but as a vessel for meaning. Without it, he warned, the soul starves. And in his own life, he lived this truth.
He built a stone tower in Bollingen, on the shores of Lake Zurich, a place with no electricity, no modern comforts. There he carved wood, sculpted stone, painted mandalas, and wrote in silence. He swam in the cold lake. He lit fires. He lived simply, not as escape, but as return. The tower was not a retreat from the world. It was a return to the essential. In Bollingen, Jung was not a professor, not a doctor, not a thinker. He was simply a man, present, aware, connected to the rhythms of nature and the depths of his own soul. And there he discovered something profound. Wholeness is not found in achievement, but in being. Carl Jung lived to the age of 85, dying on June 6, 1961, in Küsnacht, Switzerland, the same town where he had spent most of his life. He did not die in obscurity. By then, he was a figure of global influence, a thinker whose ideas had spread far beyond the world of psychology, touching philosophy, art, literature, and spirituality. But even in his final years, he remained a man of quiet intensity. He continued to write, to receive visitors, to reflect. His last recorded words, spoken to his son, were simple. Let me just sit here and look at the garden. Not a grand statement, not a final revelation, just presence, just being. And in that moment, he embodied what he had taught his entire life, that the deepest wisdom is not in the mind, but in the act of paying attention. So what does the life of Carl Jung mean, not as a biography, but as a mirror for our own? Perhaps it is this, that the greatest journey is not outward, but inward, that the most dangerous thing is not the unknown world, but the unknown self, and that true courage
is not in conquering others, but in facing what we have buried within. Jung did not promise happiness. He did not promise peace. He promised wholeness, a state not of perfection, but of integration. To be whole is not to be flawless. It is to carry your light and your darkness, your strength and your wound, your reason and your mystery, and to say, "This is me." He taught that the things we fear, our anger, our grief, our doubt, are not enemies. They are messengers. They are parts of the soul asking to be seen. And when we turn away, they grow louder. When we welcome them, they transform. This is the essence of individuation. Not becoming special, but becoming real. Not standing out, but showing up as you are. And in a world that rewards performance over presence, that values image over depth, that confuses success with meaning, this is the most revolutionary act of all.
Jung's life was not a model to imitate. It was an invitation to explore, to listen to your dreams, to question your certainties, to honor your darkness as much as your light. He showed us that the psyche is not a problem to be fixed, but a universe to be lived. That every person carries within them not just a self, but a cosmos of memories, symbols, archetypes, and potentials waiting to be awakened. And he reminded us of a truth we keep forgetting. You are not broken. You are in process. You are not lost. You are descending into yourself. So when you feel that ache, that emptiness, that sense that something is missing, do not run, do not distract, do not medicate it away. Instead, ask, what part of me is trying to speak? What dream have I ignored? What wound have I buried? Because the path back to yourself is not through more doing, but through more being. Not through fixing, but through listening. Not through escaping the darkness, but through walking into it with courage, with curiosity, with love. And as Jung himself said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But he also said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. So the question is not whether you will face your depths. The question is whether you will do it consciously or unconsciously.
Will you keep repeating the same patterns, wondering why your relationships fail, why you feel empty, why nothing lasts? Or will you stop, sit down, and begin the work? Because the self is waiting, not in the future, not in success, not in another person, but here, now, within. And the journey back, though long, though painful, though uncertain, is the only journey that truly matters. This is the legacy of Carl Jung, not a theory, not a method, but a call, a quiet, persistent call to become who you already are. This channel exists to guide you into that inner world, to help you face what Jung called the shadow, to ask, what truth are you afraid to integrate? If this video stirred something, a memory, a feeling of unease, a glimpse of your own abyss, then it has done its work. Subscribe to Psikelogy, turn on the bell. The next videos will go deeper into the unconscious mind, where true transformation begins. Leave a comment below. Share this with someone who's ready to face their own inner demons. Because the path to wholeness doesn't lie in escaping your darkness. It lies in embracing it, fully, fiercely, without compromise.